The sky over New York tore open, like it had remembered that it was only a thin idea, not a fact. It happened without sirens, without warnings, in an instant between heartbeats. 1 second, Central Park was a patchwork of spring green and tourist chatter, and the lazy hum of drones taking photos. The next, the world was white gold and screaming. Light fell first, not downward, but outward, a tidal shock of radiance that had weight, that pressed on eyes and blood and bone as if gravity itself had been persuaded to kneel. The clouds did not part so much as recoil, shredding into vapour the edges of the wound. At its centre, something pushed through. Neither ship, nor meteor, nor anything the modern world had words for. An advancing plane of incandescent geometry, angles that hurt to look at, arcs bending through dimensions the park had never needed until now. People dropped. Not all at once. The older fell first, clutching at their heads, then the children who had been closest to laughing. Then the tourists with earbuds and guided audio tours, knees hitting grass, bodies collapsing as if strings had been cut. Phones burst like fragile eggs, screens spidering, microchips sizzling under a psychic pressure that had no business caring about silicon. Camera drones spiraled, their gyros screaming, then slammed into trees and statues. Pigeons simply died where they perched, falling like grey snow. The air tasted suddenly metallic and too warm, like blood on the tongue of a dying star. At the heart of the rupture, reality shuddered and then accepted its loss. A figure stepped through. There was no flash for him, no thunderclap. The universe simply acknowledged his presence, the way a room changes when someone opens a door onto a winter storm. He descended with the slow inevitability of an executioner's blade, boots touching the cracked stone of a path now spiderwebbed from the stress of his arrival. He was tall beyond human proportion, yet his mass sat in space as naturally as a mountain on a horizon. Gilded armour encased him, not as decoration, but as a statement of metaphysical fact. Plates of auramite etched with sigils that felt older than any mythology mankind had ever whispered around campfires. The gold did not reflect the New York sun. No, it made a second sun, pale by comparison, that burned outward from him in waves of shimmering psychic force. Around his head, the light gathered and hardened into a faint coronal halo, a crown of fire that cast no shadow. His eyes burned, not with mere luminosity, but with depth, layers upon layers of ages seen and judged, the light of 1,000 victories and 100 betrayals compressing into twin stars behind his brow. He looked upon Central Park, upon humanity's little playground of concrete and grass and fountains, and his expression was something between sorrow and assessment, between a father finding his children asleep on railroad tracks and a general measuring terrain for war. A ripple rolled outward from him, invisible but undeniable. Car alarms died. A nearby subway train screamed to a halt in its tunnel as control systems rebooted in psychic panic. Every satellite that could see this stretch of New York flickered, their feeds collapsing into static for a full second as an unquantifiable presence brushed their machine minds aside like dust on a relic. Somewhere, deep in shielded bunkers, old men watching too many screens stiffened as warning lights eclipsed normal operating parameters and then vanished entirely. Only one signal cut through, impossibly clear. an immeasurable surge of psychic output where there should have been none, a flare on the mental spectrum bright enough to blind any telepath foolish enough to look directly. Sirens finally started. Too late, too human. The Emperor of Mankind breathed in the air of Earth, this timeline, this fragile playground of heroes and villains. And for a moment, his eyes closed. This world was younger than the one he remembered, less scarred, less twisted by the long decay of 10,000 years. There were no hive cities choking continents, no permanent scars of exterminatus carved into continents. Its warp signature, by comparison, was almost innocent, a surface of dark water only filmy with corruption, polluted, but not yet turned to tar. It cut him deeper than he would ever show. This is what they might have had, he thought, if the great work had not fractured on the anvil of their own fear. "You feel that?" Tony Stark spat the words as he stumbled out of the suit cradle in the penthouse of Stark Tower, palms pressed to his temples. The HUD had flared too bright and then blanked out, Jarvis's voice evaporating mid-sentence like someone had pulled the plug on God. "Because I feel that. I feel that in teeth I don't have." "Mr. Stark," Jarvis's voice stuttered back to life, distorted, thinner, like it was speaking from the bottom of a well. "There is an anomalous energy event centered on Central Park. All sensors are being overridden. I cannot... Apologies, sir. I am boosting redundancies." "Yeah, you do that," Tony muttered, clawing the suit back onto his body piece by piece, hands shaking more with adrenaline than with fear. The arc reactor in his chest was humming in a pitch it had never used before, a note that set his heart on edge. "Call everyone. Banner, Rogers, Legolas, Magical Beyoncé, everyone." "Calls have already been initiated," Jarvis replied. "Additional note, the event is observing me back." Tony stopped physically for half a heartbeat, chest plate halfway locked. "Explain?" "I believe," Jarvis said, "something at the center of that phenomenon became aware of my attempts to scan it." The armor sealed around Tony with a hiss that sounded less reassuring than usual. "Then let's hope it doesn't swipe left." Steve Rogers was already running by the time the alert pinged, shield in hand, boots hammering pavement. The new world had its conveniences. Quinjets, secure comms, planetary defense protocols. But some parts of him trusted those less than the pure, simple certainty of his own legs. He felt the tremor in the ground before the message confirmed it. A subtle, long-wave rumble that was not a bomb, not artillery, nothing he'd trained for yet somehow understood. Something big had arrived. At the Sanctum Sanctorum, a cup shattered on the floor as the air thickened like wet cloth. Dr. Stephen Strange's hands trembled, unbidden, the old scars in his nerve pathways lighting up like someone was playing plucked strings of glass inside his skin. The eye of Agamotto on his chest opened of its own accord, gyroscopic rings spinning in wild agitation. Strange looked up through the skylight, through layers of reality only he could see, and saw the sky tearing. The astral winds howled like wolves. On the helicarrier, alarms blared in Fury's one good ear as his staff shouted readings that didn't make sense. Thor was already moving, calling Mjolnir with a flick of his wrist, the hammer slamming into his palm as he strode towards the exit bay. "Something comes," he said, voice grim. "A power I have not felt even in the oldest tales." "Oh, good," Natasha muttered, checking the load on her pistols. "Because I was worried things were getting too quiet." They converged on Central Park like antibodies rushing to an infection. Iron Man cut through the air, thrusters screaming against turbulence that seemed less wind and more opinion. The Quinjet knifed between skyscrapers carrying Steve, Natasha, Wanda, and a quietly seething Vision whose forehead jewel glowed with cautious interest. Thor rode a column of storm cloud and lightning, a primal rebuttal forming in thunderheads. Spider-Man swung in last, because of course he did, still breathless from an algebra test he'd barely finished. Tony was the first to see the figure clearly, HUD filters recalibrating frantically to process data that refused to fit in existing boxes. He said on the shared channel. "We've got a cosplayer in gold plate mail who thinks he's the light bulb of the sun. Be advised." "Is he hostile?" Steve asked. Even through comms, Tony could hear the quality in his voice, the steel under the soft vowels. "Define hostile," Tony muttered as his suit shivered. Power consumption spiked for no reason. Let's say ominous with strong potential, and go from there." They landed in a rough circle around the intruder, boots sinking into grass that had browned in a perfect radius around him, as if chlorophyll had remembered mortality. The air was hot and dry. The breeze shot through with the faint smell of incense and something older, like dust shaken from the bones of forgotten titans. Civilians lay scattered, not dead but unconscious, breathing shallowly with their eyes rolled back. Nearby, a NYPD cruiser sat with its engine dead, radio hissing static. The figure turned to face them. When his gaze touched each of them in turn, they felt it, like a beam of invisible radiation sliding along bone. Tony's HUD flickered again. For a terrifying second, every diagnostic readout vanished and was replaced by a single word in a language he did not know, but somehow grasped as insufficient. He blinked and it was gone. "Okay, that's new," he muttered. "You are Avengers." The voice rolled across the park, not through air, but through mind, resonating in skulls as much as ears. It carried an ancient cadence, words set in a rhythm that felt like scripture and sentence passed in one. It was not loud in the way explosions are loud. It was loud in the way oceans are. Steve's jaw tightened. He took a deliberate step forward, shield raised, but not aggressive. "I'm Steve Rogers," he said. "We don't want any trouble. You've hurt a lot of people just showing up. You want to explain who you are and why you tore open our sky." The golden giant regarded him for a long heartbeat. "I am who your kind has called many things," he said. "God, king, monster, vision." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, bitter and distant. "In the time that yet may be, I am the emperor of mankind." Thor's eyes narrowed. "There is no such emperor among the 9 realms." "Your 9 realms," the emperor said mildly. are but one branch on a tree whose roots drink from the same poison sea. Strange stepped forward, cloak fluttering restlessly around him, as if caught in a wind only it could feel. "You tore a hole from somewhere else," he said. "Not from another dimension as we know them. From a deeper layer." He felt it even now, a pressure at the edge of his mystical senses, a bruise forming on the weave of reality where this being had forced his way through. And in doing so, you've disturbed forces that will not ignore this. The Emperor inclined his head, a tiny nod of respect. "You see more than most." "Yeah, and what I'm seeing isn't making me feel warm and fuzzy," Strange said dryly. Inside, though, his mind was buzzing. The energy patterns around the Emperor were unlike anything he'd studied. A fusion of psychic resonance and something like raw, disciplined will compressed into a singularity. If the Mind Stone was a candle, this being was a fusion core. "You said, 'in the time that yet may be,'" Tony cut in, hovering a meter off the ground, repulsors humming. "That sounds suspiciously like a time traveler line. And trust me, we're already on a first-name basis with timelines being a mess. So, Goldfinger, you want to stop being vague and get to the part where you either ask for help or threaten to kill us." The Emperor's eyes turned to him, and Tony's mouth went dry. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sudden, skin-stripping awareness of being seen. Every thought, every triumph, every mistake laid bare in the instant their gazes met. Afghanistan, Obadiah, Ultron, Sokovia. The vision of a dead world with his friends in the wreckage. For a heartbeat, Tony felt it all again, sharpened and refracted, and then the pressure eased. "Anthony Edward Stark," the Emperor said, "builder of cages, friend of monsters, at war with yourself." Tony's sarcasm framed itself, then died unspoken. The Emperor's gaze moved across the circle. Thor Odinson, who doubts his own storms. Wanda Maximoff, who fears the tremor in her soul. Vision, who does not know whether he is man or instrument. Stephen Strange, who barters arrogance for responsibility. Peter Parker, child who runs towards fire. Natasha Romanoff, who counts her ledger in red and suspects it can never be wiped clean. Steve Rogers. He paused, eyes lingering on the star on the shield. Man out of time, who clings to an ideal as others cling to breath. Steve swallowed. "You know a lot about us. We don't know anything about you. That's not a fair start." "Fairness," the Emperor said softly, "is not a word the universe respects. Only strength, intention, and the will to pay the price they demand." Strange frowned. "Price for what?" The Emperor looked up at the torn sky, where his arrival still scarred the heavens, a slow, healing wound fringed with flickering, iridescent fire. Beyond it, he could taste it, the warp. Even here, even now, in this young timeline, that roiling sea of unreason pressed close, hungry and curious. His crossing had tugged at it, a flash in deep water, and the predators had turned their heads. Unity, he said. The word carried weight. It hung in the air like a verdict. Your species stands at a precipice. Here, in this branch of possibility, you play at war and call it heroism. You dance on the edge of extinction and call it freedom. You squabble over borders and egos while the true enemy circles beyond sight. He extended a hand, palm up. Lines of power traced themselves in the air, golden and precise, as if reality itself were a schematics display responding to his will. For a moment, the Avengers saw images not in front of them, but behind their eyelids. Worlds on fire, skies cargo-load with dead ships, titans clashing in void, a throne of skulls, a plague of tentacled rot swallowing stars, a laughing kaleidoscope of impossible geometries tearing sanity into ribbons. There are powers beyond your gods and your stones, the Emperor said. They feast on misery, on contradiction, on the heat of minds that do not know how to be whole. I come from a time where humanity, my humanity, failed to unite in time, where those powers broke our defenses and turned the galaxy into a charnel house. I have waded through eons of blood to reach this divergent point. Tony found his voice again, pushed it through a dry throat. So, let me guess, he said. You're here to make sure we don't screw it up, like your guys did. I am.
Here to do what is necessary, the Emperor said. You will unify under a single guiding will, or you will be consumed. Those are the options the cosmos allows. Steve's fingers tightened around the straps of his shield. That sounds a lot like kneel or die. The Emperor's gaze sharpened. If your world burns because you could not surrender your illusions of liberty, what comfort will that word be to the dead? Liberty isn't an illusion, Steve said, stepping closer, the star on his chest catching some of the gold light and beating it back in silver. It's messy. It's hard. People make mistakes. But telling the whole planet you don't get to choose because I know better, that's not saving humanity. That's owning it. Spoken like a man who has never seen what I have seen. The Emperor's voice dropped, deepened, picked up a chill. For a heartbeat, the air around him seemed crowded with shadows, ghost-like silhouettes of billions kneeling under banners that snapped in poisonous winds. You have fought wars, Captain Rogers. Brave ones. Just ones, perhaps. But you have never watched your species flayed on the altar of its own contradictions. I have. You hurt people just by arriving, Wanda said quietly, eyes flicking to the unconscious bodies around them. Her fingers twitched, red energy stirring like a sleeping snake. If this is you helping, I don't think we want to see you angry. They will suffer worse if I do nothing, the Emperor replied. This pain is temporary. What waits outside. He let the sentence trail off. The warp pulsed against his senses, an eager hand at the door. Strange lifted a hand, glowing threads curling from his fingers. You mentioned powers beyond our stones. Fine. We have a habit of punching above our weight. You want unity? Maybe start with an explanation instead of mind tricks and intimidation. We've dealt with gods before. I am not a god, the Emperor said, and the denial held no humility, only precision. I am purpose given flesh. I am necessity expressed as will. I seek no worship, only obedience. That's comforting, Tony muttered. Look, he said more loudly. We get it, big guy. Bad stuff is coming. You want to help? Great. But Earth isn't a chessboard where you get to sweep the pieces aside and start over. We've got our own system, our own messy, dysfunctional, occasionally catastrophic way of doing things. You don't get to just show up and call dibs on the species. The Emperor sighed. It was a small sound, but the trees seemed to lean away from it. I did not come to debate philosophy with children, he said. The psychic pressure spiked. Wanda staggered. Tony's HUD blurred. Strange gritted his teeth as a spike of pain lanced through his third eye. You will understand in time. For now, know this. I will reshape your governance. I will forge your kind into a single spear.
Directed outward, not inward. In doing so, I will spare you the fate that befell my own. I will not ask for permission. Thor raised Mjolnir. Lightning crawled down his arm, wrapping the hammer in crackling, furious arcs. Then you will find Midgard does not submit so easily, he said. We may disagree amongst ourselves, but when a tyrant claims dominion, we stand together. The Emperor's eyes flared. The golden aura around him intensified, not in heat, but in definition, edges sharpening like a blade being honed. Then stand, he said, and be measured. The fight began not with a punch, but with a thought. Tony fired first because he always did. Repulsors blasted white-hot beams toward the Emperor's chest, overcharging the air, cracking stone as they tore across the park. They hit a meter from their target and simply bent, arcing around him like water flowing around a rock. Energy readings spiked, then vanished as the beams dissolved into golden mist. That's cheating, Tony hissed, adjusting output. Let's see how you like... Antony? The Emperor's voice whispered directly into his skull, bypassing ears and comms. You wrapped yourself in metal to keep the world out and your guilt in. Did you think such shells matter to me? Tony felt every servo lock at once. The suit froze mid-flight, systems whiting out in a cascade. Warning icons flared and then flattened. He dropped like a stone, cursing, only to jerk to a hissing halt a meter above the ground as some invisible hand caught him. Iron Man hung there, humiliated and immobile, muscles straining against his own armour. Okay, he managed through gritted teeth. This is worse than the time my suit got hacked by a teenager. Thor roared and brought Mjolnir down in a swing that had cracked the jaw of a Hulk. Lightning flared, brilliant and pure, the kind that split ancient oaks and melted sand into glass. The hammer struck the Emperor's raised hand with a sound like a bell being hammered by a god. For a heartbeat, the world went white. When the after-images cleared, Thor was on one knee, breath
ragged, Mjolnir's handle still in his grip but its head pressed firmly into the Emperor's open palm. No burn marks marred the golden armour. Instead, faint runes glowed along the Emperor's gauntlet, absorbing and rearranging the stolen power. "You wield the storm as a child wields a toy," the Emperor said, voice not unkind but utterly dismissive. "This, too, can be honed." He flicked his wrist. Thor flew, slamming into a statue with enough force to shatter it into dust before tumbling to a groaning halt. Strange's hands flew through the air, tracing complex mandalas that burned neon against the warped sunset. Shields bloomed in front of the Avengers, shimmering discs of emerald energy that layered themselves between their frail human bodies and that impossible presence. The eye on his chest blazed, time itself stretching thin around
him as he reached for its power. "You won't remake this world by fiat," he said, "not while I guard its doorways." The Emperor looked at the spells with interest. "Ah," he said, "your mysticism is a crude map drawn over a continent you cannot yet fully see. But there is potential." Golden fire licked along his fingers. Strange felt his sigils unravel, not shattered but corrected. Lines realigned according to a geometry he didn't recognize. His shields flickered, colour bleeding from them as if someone had drained their intention. "What?" he began, and then his mouth snapped shut as an invisible force clamped his jaw. Wanda's scarlet energy surged from her fingertips, wild and chaotic, born of trauma and fear and power she barely understood. She reached into the Emperor's mind, or tried to, her hex slipping into the gaps between thoughts, seeking fears, doubts, fractures. She found a wall. Not an absence, oh no, not that, but a fortress of thought so vast it blotted out her sense of scale. It was like pressing a bare hand against the surface of a star. For a moment, something ancient and iron-hard looked back at her across that contact. Not with malice, but with a kind of tragic patience. Her power sputtered. She cried out, staggered backward, eyes wide with the echo of him. Vision moved, hoping the Mind Stone would be the equalizer it had never quite been. A thin, focused beam of pure mental energy lanced from his forehead, spearing towards the Emperor's brow. It stopped a hair's breadth away, held by a golden lattice that had not been there a heartbeat before. "Ah," the Emperor murmured. "A fragment." The Mind Stone thrummed in Vision's skull, a high, keening note as it strained. For an instant, Vision glimpsed a vast, blazing city of golden towers under a dead sky, a throne bridging life and death, an unending surge of souls feeding a distant beacon. He saw a universe at war with itself. Then the contact snapped. Vision fell to one knee, the stone dimming. Peter swung in, because that's what you do when everyone else is getting wrecked. You jump in too. He fired webs at the Emperor's face, more out of habit than strategy. The strands hit the golden aura and ignited, burning away in curls of acrid smoke. "Okay, yeah, that tracks," Peter muttered, flipping back to land near Steve. "Cap, what's the plan?" Steve's chest heaved, his mind racing. They couldn't beat this, not like this. But that had never mattered before. What mattered was standing. "We keep him here," he said. "We keep people away. We buy as much time as we can, and we don't let him decide what we are." He charged. It was madness. He did it anyway. The world narrowed to the gleam of gold ahead of him,
The weight of vibranium on his arm, the simple purity of forward motion. He slammed into the Emperor with everything he had, shield leading, legs driving. The impact echoed like a church bell. For a fraction
of a second, Steve was sure he'd done nothing. Then, the Emperor took half a step back. Dust puffed under his boots. It wasn't much. It was everything. The Emperor looked down at the star-spangled shield pressed against his chest. His eyes met Steve's at close range. "You are what your kind should have been," he said quietly. "Unbroken. Unbent." Steve grunted. "We're not kneeling. Not today." The Emperor's hand closed gently over the edge of the shield. Steve felt his grip ripped away as easily as if he'd been a child holding a toy. The Emperor held the shield between finger and thumb, almost delicately, then set it back in Steve's hands as if returning something cherished. "I do not wish this to be a slaughter," he said aloud, voice rolling over all of them. "You have courage. You have potential. But you are not ready to judge the scale I see." He lifted his hand. The golden aura swelled. For one heartbeat, every Avenger felt a crushing weight, as if the atmosphere had thickened into iron. Knees buckled, hearts stuttered, thoughts slowed to a crawl. Then, with ruthless precision, the Emperor withdrew the pressure, letting them slump to the ground rather than shatter. One by one they found themselves prone, panting, unable to move more than fingers and eyes. "I will not kill you," the Emperor said. "You are not my enemy. You are children playing at war on the shore while a tidal wave rises behind you." Strange, forced words passed the vice on his lungs. "You can't just take control of Earth," he gasped. "We won't let you." The Emperor looked up at the sky again. He could already feel it, the warp currents shifting, attention turning. His arrival here, so far back along the timeline, so far from his own dead age, had sent a flare into that roiling sea. The ruinous powers had noticed. They were moving faster now, like sharks scenting blood. Time was shorter than he'd hoped. "I will give you a choice," he said. "You have 3 of your days. In that span, your world may decide. Submit to unification under my guidance, that you may be hardened against what comes. Or cling to your fragmented freedoms and be unified by necessity, under fire." Golden light coiled around him, lifting him off the ground. Earth's gravity seemed to lose its claim. "I will prepare a place from which to shield this world. Watch me. Consider." The sky tore again, but this time more cleanly. The Emperor rose straight up, a streak of burning gold, punching through the thin, complaining atmosphere like it was paper. Shockwaves rolled outward, toppling trees, rattling glass in skyscrapers miles away. Then he was gone, a fading star heading for the cold, dead face of the moon. Above them, a new light blinked briefly, like the first spark of a forge catching against old metal. Tony groaned as motor control returned to his suit, step by step, like someone flipping circuit breakers. "Okay," he said, voice a little higher than usual. "So, that happened." Steve pushed himself to his feet slowly, using the shield as a crutch. "We have 3 days," he said, "to figure out if he's right, or how to stop him if he's wrong." Strange stared up at the sky, feeling the fabric of reality where it had been bruised. The warp was pressing closer. He could taste it like copper on his tongue. "We might not have 3, he murmured. On the moon, the Emperor landed in silence. The regolith puffed under his boots, grey dust dancing in slow, graceful arcs in the low gravity. Above him, Earth hung like a blue-green gem, fragile and ignorant. He looked at it for a long moment, remembering his own Terra, a cracked, polluted shell wrapped in fortress worlds and orbital guns. This Earth was so young, so alive. It made something twist in his chest he refused to name. "This time," he said softly to the dead landscape, "I will not fail you." He raised his hands. Power flowed. Golden light erupted from the moon's surface, carving out mass with contemptuous ease. Rock liquefied, then reformed under his will, becoming vast, soaring structures that defied gravity more by decree than engineering. Towers of auramite rose like a forest of metallic spears, interlaced with pulsing conduits of psychic energy. At the centre, a throne grew, not a seat of comfort, but a device, an anchor point, a focal nexus for what he intended to do. He did not intend to sit upon it for 10,000 years again. He intended something new. The golden throne of this reality took shape in minutes, a process that should have taken thousands of lifetimes of labour condensed into a single expression of will. To observers on Earth, the moon sprouted a halo, a faint, shimmering lattice of gold that wrapped around it like a ring of ghostly fire. Telescopes turned, cameras zoomed. The world watched as a god built a fortress in the sky. The Emperor stepped onto the nascent throne, feeling its conduits link with him, threads of psychic potential anchoring into his vast soul. This would be the heart of the barrier he planned to throw around Earth, a bulwark against warp incursions. But it would not be enough by itself. He could feel already the restless stirrings beyond the veil, the warp boiling in anticipation. He needed more power. The stones. Infinity condensed into 6 facets, scattered across the cosmos of this branch. He had not had such tools in his own age. Here, he could use them. If he could convince, or compel, these heroes to help. 3 days, he repeated to the empty moon. But the enemy will not wait politely at the door. He closed his eyes. His consciousness stretched, unfurling like a golden net across the gulf of space and down towards the blue world below. Minds sparkled in his awareness, billions of them, each a tiny flame. He brushed them lightly, tasting fear, wonder, disbelief. Governments scrambling, militaries plotting, priests praying, children asking if the man in gold was an angel. He could crush all their doubts with a single mental command. It would be so easy to press their wills into alignment, to make them march as one. So easy, and so dangerously close to what the dark gods desired. The ruinous powers fed on extremity, on passion turned to obsession, on fear turned to despair. On order turned to ossified tyranny. He had learned, too late, that even unity could curdle into their feast if it was built on the wrong foundation. He would not repeat that error, not in the same way. So, instead of bending the world all at once, he chose a subtler path. Threads of thought extended, thin and precise, touching only a handful of minds. Avengers, champions, symbols, the ones through whom this world often chose its fate. In Stark Tower, Tony's world blurred. One moment he was pacing, suit half stripped, arguing with no one in particular while screens vomited data. The next, he was elsewhere. Not physically, his body remained where it was, but his mind stepped sideways into a space that was not space. A mindscape built of golden light and endless black. "Okay," he said, looking around. "Either I'm dreaming or I'm having the worst reaction to that shawarma last night." Light coalesced ahead of him into the shape of the Emperor, though less blinding, scaled down to something Tony's psyche could tolerate without screaming. Here, in this place of thought, the golden armour took on softer edges, details blooming like memory. "Anthony Stark," the Emperor said. His voice here was clearer, less thunder, more chisel. "I am speaking only to you. Your body is unharmed. Time here moves differently." "Right," Tony said, crossing imaginary arms over his chest. "Welcome to my head. Careful you don't trip over the unresolved issues." The Emperor regarded him with something almost like amusement. "Your mind is sharp," he said. "Like a blade honed too quickly. It cuts, but lacks a proper hilt." "Are you here to critique my psyche, or did you want something?" Tony asked. "Because we already had the big kneel or else speech and, spoiler, it didn't test well with audiences." The Emperor's eyes flicked briefly, as if seeing whole futures in that sarcasm. "You seek control," he said. "You build armor around everything, yourself, your world. You have seen in visions and in your own mistakes what happens when power is unguarded." "The enemy I speak of makes Ultron look like a child's tantrum." A flicker of images passed through Tony's mind, not his own, but the Emperor's. A titan of metal and malice, planet-sized, devouring worlds, warp storms turning fleets into screaming sculptures. A man with a skull for a throne laughing as 1,000,000 lives burned. Tony flinched, hand going unconsciously to his chest. The arc reactor hummed beneath phantom fingers. "I can give you the means to protect this world," the Emperor continued. "To build defenses that will not fail when lesser minds falter. Technologies beyond your comprehension, anchored by my knowledge and your imagination." "And the price?" Tony asked, because he'd played this game enough times. "Obedience?" "Alignment," the Emperor said. "Cooperation. You will aid me in constructing a barrier that will shield this reality. In doing so, you will become the architect of Earth's salvation, not merely its tinkerer at the edge of catastrophe." Tony chewed on that. Fear warred with pride in his chest. Build a planetary shield that would actually work. Fix the hole in the sky. Make sure his nightmares never came true. It was everything he wanted. It was also everything he was afraid of. "You understand that you're basically tempting me with my own worst impulses, right?" he said.
Last time I tried to put a suit of armor around the world, it tried to drop a city on the world. People died. A lot of them. So forgive me if I'm not jumping at the chance to repeat that on a cosmic scale. The Emperor's gaze softened. You learned from that failure, he said. Painfully, but you did learn. I have walked longer roads of failure than you can imagine. Together, our errors need not be repeated. They can be refined. Tony snorted. That's one way to spin "we screw up, but in new and interesting ways." The Emperor stepped closer. Golden aura dimmed. I am not asking you to surrender your will, he said. I am asking you to align it with a purpose beyond your singular fears. To use your genius not as a shield for your own conscience, but as a tool for a species' survival. You say that like I haven't been trying, Tony snapped, sudden anger flaring. I nearly died dragging a nuke through a portal. I put a god in a cage. And each time, the Emperor interrupted gently, you acted alone, or nearly so. Driven by visions only you had seen, carrying burdens you did not fully share. You do not trust easily, not others, and not yourself. The words cut. Tony hated how much they fit. You're not wrong, he muttered, annoyingly. Then trust in this, the Emperor said, and for the first time there was something like raw urgency in his tone. The warp I speak of is not metaphor. It is real. It is moving. My arrival here has hastened its gaze. You have 3 days by my reaping of time, but the enemy does not respect such
boundaries. Help me build the barrier. Help me gather your stones. Or watch as your world's petty squabbles become irrelevant in the face of a tide you cannot name. And if we help you, Tony said slowly, do we get a say in what this unified humanity looks like? Or are we just upgrading the bars on our own cage? The Emperor's jaw tightened. Unity is not tyranny, he said. It is the alignment of purpose. But purpose requires hierarchy, discipline, sacrifice. Yeah, I've had that conversation with a guy holding a glowing scepter once, Tony cut in. Spoiler, didn't end well for him. The Emperor's eyes flashed at the mention of Loki, though Tony didn't know why. I am not that trickster, he said. I do not delight in domination for its own sake. I carry a burden of necessity. Believe this if you believe nothing else. I am willing to pay any cost myself that I ask of others. Something in the way he said it, quiet, almost weary, slid under Tony's defences. He saw, for a heartbeat, an image that wasn't his. A man nailed to a throne, flesh rotting, will burning like a sun, holding back a tide of monsters with the screaming souls of thousands. Tony looked away. I'll talk to the others, he said. We're not exactly the United Nations, but we're what you've got. Just don't expect a unanimous vote for all hail Space Dad. The Emperor inclined his head. That is all I ask, he said. Consider. The mindscape dissolved. Tony staggered back into his own body, grabbing a table for balance. The screens were still scrolling. Jarvis was still talking. But the room felt smaller, the earth below him
thinner. Elsewhere, in a crimson-lit space filled with memories of Sokovia and a twin brother who'd died too fast, Wanda gasped as golden light poured through her mind, offering control, mastery, and a way to stop being afraid of herself. In the sanctum, Strange felt hands guiding his through spells that had taken him years to learn, hinting at entire libraries of cosmic knowledge. On the helicarrier, Thor saw visions of battle formations that could turn Midgard into a citadel. The Emperor spoke to them all, each temptation tailored, each offer edged with necessity. But when the dust settled, the Avengers did what they always did. They met. They argued. They tried to find a third way. "We can't just say yes," Steve said, palms flat on the table in the conference room, the world's most mismatched family arguing under fluorescent lights while the moon glowed gold in the sky. "We don't know where this ends if we hand him the keys." "We also can't pretend he's bluffing," Strange said. "He tore a hole in the fabric of reality without breaking a sweat. He's not lying about the warp, I can feel it. It's interested. We don't have the infrastructure to fight a four-dimensional demon war," Tony said, pinching the bridge of his
nose. "We barely have the infrastructure to patch up after our own mistakes." "Then perhaps we do both," Thor said. "We accept his aid in building this barrier, but on our terms. We do not kneel, but we stand beside him. Warriors, not subjects." Natasha raised an eyebrow. "You really think someone like that understands the word beside?" "He isn't wrong about the stakes," Vision said quietly. "If the warp is what he claims, then individual liberties may indeed be luxuries." "Be careful," Steve said sharply. "We don't throw away what we are because someone says it's inefficient. That's not who we're supposed to be." "Tell that to the dead if this barrier fails because we were too proud to make hard choices," Tony said. "We are not deciding between good and bad, Steve. We're deciding between bad and worse." Strange looked up at the ceiling as if seeking answers in the ductwork. "He said he needs the stones," he said. "We know where some of them are. We can help gather them. But if we hand him reality, time, space, mind, soul, and power, we'd be creating something that might be as dangerous as the thing he wants to keep out." "Then we build fail-safes," Tony said. "Control circuits, magical, fuses, whatever. We design the system so that if he goes rogue, we can shut it down." "You want to build a kill switch for a being who can freeze your armor with a thought," Natasha said. "Ambitious." "It's what I do," Tony said. "I build contingencies, and then I pray we never need them." Silence settled, heavy and thick. They all knew the pattern by now. Threat arrives, they resist, they adapt, they improvise. But this was different. This wasn't an alien fleet or a robot army. This was a man offering to reshape the rules. "We don't have time to solve every moral question," Strange said at last, voice low. "If the warp comes through that tear in the sky, there won't be anyone left to care about whether we kept our hands clean." Steve closed his eyes briefly. In the dark behind his lids he saw a dance hall, a date he'd never made, a promise in the wreckage of a plane going down. He saw a world that had kept going without him, making new mistakes, new burns, new scars. He opened his eyes. "We tell him this," he said.
We'll help build his barrier. We'll help gather the stones. But Earth doesn't become a dictatorship. Not under him, not under anyone. This unified humanity he wants, it has to choose to stand together, not be forced. He won't like that, Natasha said. He doesn't have to, Steve replied. He just has to understand that we're not the species he lost. We're ours. Thor nodded slowly. A third way, he said. Very well. Let us go tell your Emperor of Mankind that Midgard does not kneel, but it will fight. So they went. Tony, Strange, Thor, 3 facets of Earth's defiance, took a Quinjet.
And then a nearer conveyance, Strange conjured from folded space, stepping across void to the moon. They arrived at the edge of the Emperor's golden fortress, like intruders at a cathedral built for a god who hadn't decided yet if guests were allowed. The surface of the moon had been transformed. Where once there had been only dust and old impact scars, now rose sweeping bridges, obsidian black roads shot through with veins of glowing energy, and statues that looked back, not of the Emperor himself, but of humans in armour, faceless and endless, marching into wars that had not happened here. Above them, the golden throne glowed at the heart of a complex that looked less like a palace and more like a machine designed to interface directly with the cosmos. The Emperor stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, watching Earth. The planet spun, clouds swirling, cities winking like bioluminescent nodes in a living organism. "You come," he said without turning. "That is good." Strange stepped forward, cloak fluttering. "We've talked," he said. "We're not surrendering Earth to your rule, but we're not ignoring the threat you brought with you either. So here's our offer." Tony winced. "Our opening proposal," he corrected. "Let's not call it an offer. Sounds like we're selling timeshares." The Emperor turned. In the airless lunar silence, his presence felt even more immense. The golden aura flared against the stark black of space, drawn into sharp relief by the absence of air and sound. "Speak," he said. Thor planted Mjolnir in the regolith and stared the Emperor in the eye. "We will aid you," he said. "We will help gather these stones and forge this barrier you speak of. But Midgard will not be your subject. We are allies or nothing." "You seek parity where there is none," the Emperor said. "This is not arrogance, it is fact. Your power is considerable, but limited. Mine is—" "Yeah, we got the PowerPoint," Tony interrupted. "You're the walking sun. Newsflash, that's not the issue. The issue is trust. If we hand you the stones, we need guarantees you're not going to turn our planet into Fortress Earth with you as supreme chairperson for life." "There is no guarantee in existence," the Emperor said. "Only probability and will." Strange's eyes narrowed. "Then hear ours," he said. "This barrier we build, it cannot be centered solely on you. It must be a system, integrated with the stones, with Earth's own structures, tied into the sanctums, into the arc reactor grid, into Wakanda's vibranium network. That way, no single point of failure, no single point of control." Tony looked sideways at Strange. "Wow," he said. "Look at you, playing nice with my toys.
I said integrated, not let Stark do whatever he wants, Strange replied. Details, details. The Emperor studied them, eyes flicking from one to the other. You wish to bind
my work into your world's fabric, he said, to make it something you can touch, influence, to make it something we're all responsible for, Steve's voice said. They turned. He'd come, after all, via an earlier shuttle, helmet tucked under one arm, face set. This isn't just your burden, Steve said, walking up the ramp. It's ours. You think you're the only one who knows what it's like to carry the weight of a world. We've bled for this planet, lost people, made mistakes. We're not handing it off to a stranger, no matter how shiny his armour is. The Emperor's gaze lingered on Steve, something old and almost wistful passing through his eyes. You would share my burden, he said slowly. And yet you refuse to submit to my direction. That is contradictory. Welcome to humanity, Tony said. We contain multitudes. Strange raised a hand. We understand your urgency, he said. We believe you about the warp. We want to help. But we won't do it by becoming what we're trying to fight. If the ruinous powers feed on tyranny and madness and suffering, then building a golden cage for 8 billion people doesn't sound like starving them. It sounds like feeding them in a new way. That landed. The Emperor's jaw tightened as memory flared, of inquisitions, of purges, of entire planets burned in the name of purity, all in worlds where his own Imperium had turned its fear into ritualized cruelty. He had not ordered all of it. He had permitted too much of it. The dark gods had feasted on that permission as surely as on any rebellion. You speak truth, he admitted quietly, even if you do not understand the full scope. I tread a narrow path. Too much liberty, and humanity devours itself. Too much order, and humanity becomes tinder for darker flames. So we walk it together, Steve said. We build your barrier. We fight your warp. But Earth stays our own. And if I say no, the Emperor asked, if I insist on the purity of unity above all? Thor lifted his hammer. Strange's hands lit. Tony's reactor thrummed. Then we fight you, Steve said simply. And maybe we lose. Probably we lose. But you'll have to decide if killing the only people willing to help you on this side of reality is the best use of your time. Silence stretched, huge and delicate as the void around them. The Emperor looked past them at Earth, at the little swirls of weather that never knew how small they were, at continents shaped by history these heroes clung to like identity. He remembered his own world, locked in unending war, its people chanting his name as they marched into meat grinders. He remembered how that had started, with one man deciding he knew best. Very well, he said at last. We will do it your way. For now. Tony exhaled, tension leaking out. Great, he said. That's exactly the level of reassurance I like in a cosmic alliance. For now. The Emperor ignored the quip. We must move quickly, he said. The warp stirs. Already my passage has weakened the barrier between realities. The ruinous powers will not wait. We will need the stones. The campaign that followed would later be reduced in history books, if any survived, to a handful of bullet points. Acquisition of the Infinity Stones prior to Thanos, conducted under severe metaphysical pressure. But living it was another matter. Tesseract from S.H.I.E.L.D., ether from its cosmic hiding place, orb wrested from an unsuspecting thief before he fully became a guardian, time stone from the sanctum, convincing the Ancient One, a conversation that left Strange more shaken than he admitted, soul stone, at a cost only one of them would understand in dreams. Through it all, the Emperor moved like a golden fixed point, warping circumstances around his intention. He stepped into battles and ended them with a thought. He negotiated with aliens and gods with the tired patience of a man who had convinced 1,000 species to kneel or die. But he also watched. He watched Tony, working through sleepless nights to adapt alien designs into Earth systems without losing their humanity. He watched Strange, trying to thread his mystic barriers into something that could interlock with the Emperor's own psychic wards. He watched Wanda, learning to shape her chaos, not into weapons, but into stabilizers, muttering equations the Emperor whispered into her dreams. He watched Steve, who could offer nothing in terms of raw power to such cosmic undertakings, still stand in every room where decisions were made, asking the same irritating questions. Who does this serve? Who decides when it ends? What do we sacrifice to it? The Barrier Project became the largest collaboration in Earth's secret history. Wakandan engineers, under Shuri's brilliant annoyance, integrated vibranium lattice into a global energetic cage. Sorcerers from Kamataj traced wards along ley lines, anchoring nodes in ancient temples and new skyscrapers. Stark Industries retooled entire orbital platforms into emitters. The Emperor wove all of it together from his throne on the moon, threads of golden psychic force stitching the disparate efforts into a single tapestry. The Infinity Stones were set into a vast, circular apparatus above the throne, each held in a containment field shaped as much by magic as by science. Together, they hummed with a power that made every other artifact in the solar system seem like a candle next to a supernova. And all the while, the warp pressed closer. Strange could feel it in his dreams now. Whispers at the edge of thought, promises of knowledge, of power, of an end to uncertainty. Wanda heard laughter in the spaces between heartbeats, saw colors that didn't exist. Ordinary people woke from nightmares they couldn't remember, hearts racing, hands trembling, eyes haunted. The tear in the sky above New York, though healed, on the surface, pulsed faintly in Strange's second sight, a bruise that refused to fade. "We're running out of time," he said one day, looking out at Earth from the moon, his breath fogging his visor. "The barrier isn't ready." "It must be," the Emperor said. His own face was lined with strain now, golden aura dimmed by the constant effort of holding back pressures no one else could truly feel. Cracks had appeared in the psychic firmament he cast around the planet, tiny fissures where warp influence seeped through like poison. "If we activate it too early, it will snap," Strange said, "like a net cast before it's fully knotted." "If we delay, the net will never be cast," the Emperor replied. "The ruinous powers are not waiting for us to finish our work." On Earth, the first warp manifestations slipped through. They appeared at the edges of belief, where mass consciousness was softest. War zones, cult gatherings, places of extreme joy and extreme grief. Shadows that moved against light. murmurs in the corners of CCTV cameras. A man in a subway car suddenly screaming as his reflection smiled back with too many teeth. The Avengers fought the ones they could find. But you couldn't punch a whisper. You couldn't shield the world from nightmares with a shield and a hammer. "Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now," Tony said, staring at projections that kept updating with more anomalies. "We light this thing up or we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with demons until the concept of mole forgets it exists." They gathered once more on the moon, under the artificial gravity fields the Emperor had lazily imposed for their convenience. The stones hung overhead, blazing in their housings. The barrier lattice glowed faintly, a web of potential drawn tight around Earth, waiting to snap into full existence. "Once we activate this," Strange said, "there's no going back. The stones will be locked into the system. Thanos, if he exists in this branch, will find nothing to collect, but neither will anyone else." "I think I can live with that," Tony said. "One less purple man with a god complex to worry about." Steve frowned. "And if we're wrong?" he asked. "If this barrier does something we can't predict?" They all looked at the Emperor. He held their world in his gaze. He weighed his knowledge of the warp against the limitations of these new tools, this young reality, these infuriating, admirable heroes who refused to be his subjects. "It will hold," he said. "For a time." "Define for a time," Tony said. 3 days? 3 years? 3,000? The Emperor's eyes closed briefly, as if listening to a distant, unpleasant song. "The warp is not a static adversary," he said. "It probes, adapts, corrupts. With stones, and with my will anchoring the lattice, we may hold it at bay for centuries. Without..." He let the implication hang. "Then we..." "Light it," Strange said. "Now." They moved. Tony took his position at the control plinth, fingers dancing over interfaces that responded as much to thought as to touch. Strange anchored himself at the mystical nexus, channels of eldritch energy coiling around his hands. Wonder and vision flanked the Mind Stone's housing, their combined resonance stabilizing its wild tendencies. Thor raised Mjolnir, ready to pour storm energy into the lattice. Steve stood by the Emperor's side, not because he could contribute power, but because someone needed to watch the man at the center of it all. "Ready?" Tony asked. "Define ready," Strange muttered. "No," Steve said. "Do it anyway." Tony exhaled. "Right. Avengers..." He paused, half smiled. "And assorted golden demigods. Let's make a wall." He hit the initiator. Power surged. The stones flared, colours lancing outwards into the lattice. Blue, red, purple, green, orange, yellow. Each facet of reality's bedrock poured its essence into the web being spun around Earth. Space Stone stretched the barrier across vast distance. Time Stone anchored it in continuity, threading it through past and future. Reality Stone hardened the conceptual existence of the shield. Power Stone fueled its brute strength. Soul Stone tied it to the living essence of Earth. Mind Stone shaped its interface with consciousness. For a few glorious, terrible seconds, everything worked perfectly. The lattice brightened from faint glow to blinding brilliance, snapping into sharp, crystalline existence around the planet.
Sensors on Earth screamed in overloaded delight as an invisible wall slammed into place at the edge of the atmosphere, and then a little beyond. A shell of shimmering golden blue energy that sang in frequencies no human ear could hear. Strange saw the warp recoil like a hand yanked back from a hot stove. Demonic whispers cut off mid-word. Shadows fled. Nightmares eased. Billions slept more peacefully for the first time in days, unaware of why. "It's working," Wanda whispered, feeling the pressure in her head lessen. "It's actually—" The barrier rippled. A dark stain bloomed on its outer surface, not from outside, but from nowhere, like oil spreading in water. The stones screamed inside their housings, feedback loops spiking as something pushed back from beyond the veil with more force than anticipated. The warp had recognized the challenge. It surged. "Strain at 90%, Tony barked, reading power flows that had gone from theoretical to terrifying. 95, we're at the red line." Cracks spidered through the lattice, visible even to non-mystical senses as hairline fractures of darkness snaking through the golden shell. Through them, something looked in. Not a single entity, no, that would have been easier, but an entire ecology of malice. Rage, rot, lust and change. 4 primordial hungers pressing eagerly against an imperfect seal. "Hold,"
the Emperor said, voice a command hurled into the teeth of a storm. He poured more of himself into the throne, golden aura blazing brighter than it had since his arrival. Psychic power surged down the conduits, patching fractures, reinforcing weak nodes. The barrier steadied for a heartbeat. Then the warp adjusted. It focused, not as 4, but as 1. An entire sea pushing against a single levee. The stones flared dangerously. The time stone's ring spun so fast it blurred. The space stone's containment field flickered. Reality warped at the edges as the reality stone struggled to maintain a coherent set of facts in the face of a realm that loved contradiction. "We're at 110%, Tony yelled. "That's not just a number, that's a cry for help. System can't handle the feedback. We need to dump load or it's going to—" "We flinch now, it all collapses," Strange shouted, teeth gritted as streams of eldritch fire poured through him. "We lose everything." Steve looked at the Emperor. The golden giant's face was pale, not with fear, but with strain. For the first time he looked mortal. Lines marred his brow. Blood trickled from one nostril, boiling away in the heat of his aura. "Can you do it?" Steve asked. "Can you hold it?" "Not like this," the Emperor said. The admission tasted like ash. "The barrier is too rigid. The stones amplify its strength, but they also focus the warp's attention. They become targets." "Then take them out of the system," Tony said. "We built redundancy. We can reconfigure." "You don't have time," Strange snapped. "The warp will punch through before you can reroute. And if it does, it will come in through the pathways the stones have opened, using them as knives turned inward." The Emperor felt it too. The barrier was a drum skin drawn too tight. One more surge, one more push, and it would not simply tear. It would explode, showering the world in psychic shrapnel. "Then what?" Steve demanded. "We can't let it fail." Possibilities flickered through the Emperor's vast consciousness, branching timelines he'd learned to read like river systems. He saw outcomes, letting the barrier fail and watching Earth become a demon-haunted ruin. Hardening it by force as he'd done before, driving the world into a regimented horror that starved the warp in one sense while feeding it in another. Withdrawing, letting this reality find its own path. In none of them did humanity emerge unscathed. In all, blood flowed. In all, souls screamed. Unless the barrier was not an object, not a machine relying on external power, but a living interface, continuously adjusting, responding not only to force, but to intention. In his own timeline, he had become such a pillar without meaning to, trapped on the golden throne, his decaying body a conduit for 10,000 years of sacrifice. Here, he could choose it, not as a prison, as fulfillment. The realization settled over him like a cloak he had been wearing all along and had only just noticed. "The stones are not enough," he said. The others looked at him, shock and fear and hope swirling. "I must do what I was always meant to do." Tony's face twisted. "Define always meant in this context," he said, "because every time someone says that, it ends with someone jumping into a volcano." The Emperor stepped away from the throne's initial seat, moving towards the heart of the apparatus, where the lines of power converged. His armour shed plates as he walked, gold peeling away in layers, not falling, but dissolving into light that flowed into the conduits. Auramite turned to energy, reforming as reinforcement for the strained lattice. Beneath the armour, his body was still awe-inspiringly strong, but more human. Muscles and scars and the faint tracery of old wounds glowing with inner fire. "The barrier requires a will at its heart that can adapt as quickly as the warp," he said. "A consciousness vast enough to meet the ruinous powers on the field of thought and emotion, not merely brute force." Strange's eyes widened. "You mean a mind," the Emperor said. "A soul, bound to the lattice, not as a prisoner." He looked up at the stones, then down at Earth. His voice softened. "As a guardian." Steve stepped in front of him instinctively. "You're talking about killing yourself," he said. "Hooking yourself into that system until... what? You burn out?" "Death is a release I forfeited long ago," the Emperor replied. "This is not about my life. It is about my purpose. In my own age, I was bound to a throne and used as an engine of survival, decaying, screaming, endless. I did not choose that path. This time, I choose. This is not sacrifice, but fulfillment." The words hung in the air, sinking into the bones of everyone present. They carried no martyr's theatrics, no plea for admiration. They were simply true. "There has to be another way," Tony said, because he had to say it, because he was tired of watching people throw themselves on grenades while he lived with the blast echoes. "We designed this thing to work without burning anyone at the stake." "You designed it with my power as a given," the Emperor said gently. "I am not stepping out of the system. I am stepping fully into it.
The stones will become lenses, not fuel. Earth's defenses will be an extension of my will, yes, but not in the way you feared. I will not rule your people. I will stand watch over them. For how long? Steve asked, voice rough. As long as it takes, the Emperor said. Until the warp recedes. Until your species learns to walk without becoming prey. Until another guardian can be found. Time is less meaningful at that scale. Strange's hands trembled. You're talking about becoming a god, he said quietly. The Emperor shook his head. No, he said. Gods demand worship, obedience, and adoration. I seek none of those. I will be a wall, nothing more. Thor stepped forward, blue eyes bright with a mixture of awe and sorrow. You would imprison yourself for a world that is not your own, he said. Why? The Emperor looked at Earth one last time with human eyes. Because every time I failed my own, he said. Because I have seen what happens when no one stands in the breach. Because your world still has a chance to be what mine never was. Wanda, tears streaming down her face without her noticing, whispered, It will hurt. Yes, the Emperor said simply. He turned to Tony. Your systems will need adjustment, he said. When my consciousness merges with the lattice, you must reconfigure the stone's interfaces. They will not be able to fuel the barrier the way we planned. Instead, they will serve as anchors, preventing my will from burning out the framework. You must design along those parameters. You're asking me to help you plug yourself into a cosmic light socket, Tony said. Knowing you might fry. Knowing I will hurt, the Emperor corrected. I do not believe I will end, not as you understand it. I will change. That's not comforting, Tony muttered, wiping at his eyes angrily when he realized they were wet. But if you're going to do this anyway, better with safeguards than without. Steve reached out, hand on the Emperor's bare arm. The skin beneath his fingers was hot, but not burning. He felt heartbeat, steady and strong. You sure? He asked. It was a ridiculous question to ask a man like this. He asked it anyway. The Emperor looked at him. For a moment, the mask of the warlord fell away, and Steve saw the man beneath. The exhaustion, the haunted memories, the stubborn core of hope that refused to die, no matter how much horror it had witnessed. No, the Emperor said, but I am resolved. Steve nodded. Then we stand with you, he said. Not under, with. The Emperor inclined his head in something like a bow. That matters, he said softly. He turned and stepped into the heart of the apparatus. Light rose to meet him, lines of power reconfiguring, arcs of energy swinging into new patterns. Tony's fingers flew, reprogramming on the fly, controllers squealing as they tried to keep up. Strange chanted, voice weaving new spells that would bind soul to structure without crushing it completely. Wanda poured her chaos into smoothing edges, turning jagged transitions into curves. Thor channeled storm energy into stabilizing the initial surge. Steve watched. He had never felt so useless and so necessary at the same time. As the Emperor reached the centre, his body began to dissolve, not in the grotesque, melting way of destruction, but in a controlled unweaving. Flesh became light, bone became lines of force. His heart, still beating, became a pulsing node at the core of the lattice. His consciousness expanded, shedding the limits of single vantage points, blooming outward to fill the entire barrier like ink diffusing in water. Golden light surged through the lattice, replacing cracks with living flux. The stones hummed, their output redirected, no longer brute power, but modulation, each one adjusting a different aspect of the Emperor's now expanded mind. Timestone kept him anchored, preventing his awareness from scattering across eras. Space Stone bound him to the volume of the barrier. Reality Stone ensured his perception did not fracture in the face of the warp's contradictions. Mind Stone amplified his thought. Soul Stone tied him to the living earth. Power Stone provided the raw momentum to push back against the sea. He felt the warp hit him. It was like standing bare under an avalanche of emotion and madness. Rage, bottomless and hot as stars. Decay, slow and inevitable, whispering that all things end, so why resist? Excess, alluring and smothering, promising endless sensation. Change, flickering and sly, offering solutions that twisted into new problems. They slammed against his expanded awareness, seeking purchase, seeking cracks. He met them, not with simple denial, that had failed before, but with alignment. Rage turned into righteous fury, directed at defending rather than destroying. Decay was acknowledged as part of cycles, given boundaries. Excess was balanced with discipline. Change was accepted where it did not compromise the core. He stood, not as uncompromising monolith, but as living wall, flexing, absorbing, redirecting. Outside, to mortal eyes, the barrier brightened. The dark stains receded, the ripples smoothed. Nightmares lessened, warp incursions faded. Earth slept. On the moon, the apparatus quieted. The stones dimmed to a steady, low glow, no longer
Screaming. The throne stood empty. Where the Emperor had been, there was now a presence. They could feel it in their bones, in the air, in the way the entire solar system seemed to have acquired a watchful stillness. "Is he?" Tony began, then stopped, throat tight. "I do not sense him as a separate entity," Strange said, eyes unfocused as he reached out with his third sight. "He's everywhere, around the planet, in the barrier, a ring of will." Wanda shivered, not entirely from fear. "He's humming," she said, "like a song right at the edge of hearing." Steve looked up at Earth. It hung in its new shell of faint, shimmering gold. For a moment he thought he saw a face there, lines in clouds, patterns in light. Not the Emperor's stern visage, but something softer. Then it was gone. "Can he hear us?" Thor asked. Strange nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "He can hear everything." Steve stepped forward, helmet under his arm, staring up. "You did it," he said quietly, speaking not to the others, but to the sky. You got your unity, just not the way you thought. There was no thunder, no voice in his head, but he felt something, a warmth, a whisper of gratitude, or perhaps simply his own hope reflecting back at him. On Earth, people looked up at night and saw a faint halo around the planet, a ghostly ring of gold that hadn't been there before. Scientists called it an anomaly. Conspiracy theorists called it proof of everything. Children called it the Guardian's crown. The Avengers knew the truth, or as close to truth as mortals could get. They went on. They fought smaller battles. They dealt with threats that did not know their world was now wrapped in the will of a man who had walked a galaxy of horrors. They made mistakes. They mended them. They loved. They grieved. Tony, standing on his balcony one night with a drink he didn't intend to finish, looked up and said, "You see this, Goldie? We're still a mess down here, still arguing, still scrubbing up, just like he said." The wind tugged at his shirt. Far above, the halo shimmered faintly. Tony smiled, a little sadly. "But we're trying," he said. "So, keep watching, okay? And if the warp comes knocking again, maybe give us a heads up this time." He heard nothing. He felt something. It's enough. Strange found his spells subtly changed now. Where before he had wrestled raw forces into shape, now there was a presence at the edges of his work, like an experienced hand steadying a student's grip. He resented it at first, then learned to work with it, then referring it was not interactions, but cooperation. Wanda's nightmares lessened. When the darkness whispered, it now found another voice there as well, firmer, patient, reminding her that Fekrets, that dot seeing the privacy from Asgard, nodded in respect to the absent emperor as to a fellow guardian of realms. Steve visited the moon sometimes, though there was nothing there now but silent structures and the cold throne. He would stand in the empty chamber, look up at the apparatus where the stones hung, and talk. He never knew if anyone was listening. He did it anyway. "You said unity, and we heard tyranny," he said on one such visit, hands in his pockets. "Maybe we were right. Maybe you were. Maybe it's both. But I like to think we found something in between." The throne said nothing. The air tasted faintly of ozone and old battles. Steve smiled. "You know," he said, "for a guy who wanted obedience, you ended up doing a pretty selfless thing." He considered that, then shook his head. "No, not selfless. You got what you wanted too. A purpose, a wall to hold." He turned to go, then paused. "If you ever want to stop," he said awkwardly, feeling foolish speaking to a network of living light, "we'll be here. We'll find another way. You don't have to carry it forever." As he stepped out into the lunar sunlight, a faint tremor passed through the barrier far above Earth. No one but Strange and Wanda noticed. It felt like a sigh. Years later, when new threats arose, some from within, some from beyond,
They would find their paths subtly altered, their worst aspects blunted, their timing shifted a little in humanity's favour. A ship about to crash would find a current nudging it just enough to miss. A spell about to go catastrophically wrong would fizzle rather than explode. A man on the verge of breaking would find, for no reason he could name, the strength to hold on a little longer. The scholars of Kamartaj would speak in hushed tones of the living Aegis, the wall of will that had wrapped itself around the world. The people would tell stories of a silent guardian in gold who watched from the moon. The Avengers, older, more scarred, would clink glasses on balconies and in farmhouses and in ruined alien cities, look up at the shimmer in the sky, and feel less alone. Somewhere, everywhere, the Emperor of Mankind watched a younger humanity stumble and rise, fight and fail, and try again. He felt their contradictions, their small cruelties, their stubborn kindness. He felt the warp press and retreat, always testing, always hungering. He held, not as tyrant, not as God, as a wall, as a promise. He had come to this reality intending to forge a united empire under his hand. He had instead become its unseen shield. And in the endless, roaring silence where his expanded mind met the madness of the warp, he found, at last, something like peace.